You're live, Mayor.
I'd like to call to order the City Council special meeting of July the 11th.
Oh,
Do I need to do it over?
right.
Start again. I'd like to call to order the City Council special meeting of May the 11th, 2022. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Nixon,
Here.
Councilmember Black,
Here.
Councilmember Curtis,
Here.
Councilmember Falcone,
Here.
Councilmember Pascal,
Here.
Deputy Mayor Arnold,
Here.
Mayor Sweet.
Here. This is a public hearing to receive public comment on a proposed Google development agreement related to the 85th Street Station Area Plan. I will now open the public hearing with the July 6th Google Development Agreement study session incorporated into tonight's record. City Manager.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council. So, as you mentioned, tonight is a public hearing, but we have a presentation that's an overview of the development agreement. That presentation is going to be made by our Planning and Building Director, Adam Weinstein. This is not as detailed as the presentation received on July 6th, and as you mentioned, any member of the public who'd like to go, the full presentation is already online in our link, and people can watch the entire thing. So we don't have a lot of the background, but we're really focused on what's actually in the development agreement and our conversation tonight. We also have many staff on the line, technical staff to help. So if council has any specific questions following the presentation, we do have staff ready to assist with that. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam.
All right. Good evening, Mayor Sweet and Deputy Mayor Arnold and council members. As the city manager mentioned, this is a very short presentation. It's a public hearing tonight, so we really want to hear from the public and make sure we have enough time for that. And I will be joined by Tracy Dunlap, our Deputy City Manager, and Joel Funt, our Transportation Manager. And as the city manager mentioned, the larger cast of characters that was here for the study session will be here to answer questions. This is not a very complicated agenda tonight. We discussed the development agreement in a lot of detail last Wednesday, and we won't be going into the similar level of detail tonight, but obviously please chime in if you have any questions. So the presentation tonight really focuses less on the legal aspects of the development agreement and more on the community-facing or practical provisions and benefits of the development agreement, the ones that community members are likely to see and feel if they were to walk around the Google project and its surroundings in several years when we actually see station area plan implementation happen. And we'll also weave into this presentation some recommended changes to the development agreement made after the discussion at the study session last week, along with some clarifications. So in the study session presentation, we had a slide tracing the very long series of events leading up to the station area plan and the development agreement, starting with the initiation of the planning process surrounding that major regional transportation investment embodied in the bus rapid transit station at I-405 and 85th Street. And I won't elaborate on that, but we'll note that when a plan of this scale gets adopted, development of the plan doesn't happen spontaneously because the private sector does most of the actual building in a plan area, although public investments are crucial, and then private development happens on its own schedule. So that means that the initiation of development called for in the plan can sometimes take many years to realize and is dependent on the whims of the real estate market and the local and regional economy. And we saw that up in Totem Lake, which took many years to achieve its vision because of an economic recession, developer interest, and other factors. And so that really speaks to the importance of catalyst projects like the one that's the subject of the development agreement tonight, which can immediately generate the physical changes that the plan was intended to produce in the first place. The form-based code adopted by City Council last month explicitly recognizes the importance of catalyst projects in the station area plan as major projects that provide the right kind of development for sites that can really leverage their proximity to the bus rapid transit station while locking in public benefits and traffic mitigation and other infrastructure commitments for the community. So in doing so, the form-based code encourages that development agreements be negotiated for larger development sites of 4 acres or more in areas within close proximity to the BRT station. So this development agreement that we're talking about tonight is an implementation of something that was anticipated in the form-based code. both in terms of the actual agreement, the development agreement, which is a mechanism explicitly authorized in the adopted form-based code, and then also what that development will yield, which is a green, sustainable, employment-focused development adjacent to the bus rapid transit station that will help us achieve goals in our sustainability master plan, our comprehensive plan, our transportation master plan, and many other governing planning documents. So this is a voluntary agreement. That's a basic principle of development agreements. Giving what it does is it gives Google certainty about the future trajectory of their development, and then confirming that the rules won't change during a multi-year, multi-phase development project. And then also, of course, confirming to the community that the project will yield more public benefits, things like open space and a community benefit payment to be used for affordable housing, than what our code would otherwise require. And also that Google will build the infrastructure that's needed to support that development. All right, so the top couple bullets of the slide indicating 36 sections and 8 detailed exhibits covering 5 phases of a development project belie, I think, some of the overarching simplicity of this development agreement, which is built on a couple of key core principles. One is that the totality of the public benefits provided by Google, so I'm talking about parks and open space and bike and ped features, and also their contribution to affordable housing, will exceed the benefits that are required in the zoning code for a project of this size and height. A second principle is that on top of these public benefits, the project will exceed the sustainability requirements that the code would require for a project of this size. In addition, Google would make a voluntary financial incentive to support affordable housing, which we talked about at the study session. Lastly, Google will get impact fee credit for building community benefiting infrastructure that's not required solely to mitigate project impacts. But all of the normal requirements for development, talking about things like mitigation for things like traffic impacts that are a result of the project, will be completed by Google, and Google will be responsible for all development, impact, and connection fees associated with a project of this size. And lastly, I'll mention that the term of this agreement is 10 years and not 15 or 20 or 25 years, because we want this project to get built sooner rather than later to help realize the vision of the station area plan and all the attendant public benefits that are outlined in the DA and the development agreement. And the bottom of the slide offers up a high-level summary of the content of the development agreement, which we'll just talk about very briefly over the next several slides. Let's see. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. All right, there you go. Okay. This slide here tackles the first of those topics that were on the previous slide, which is about how the actual Google project gets approved. And here we're really just mirroring the typical design review process that would be applied to any development project of this size. The design review process is important to keep intact because it has created a very high-quality built environment in Kirkland. So this project will go through the standard two design conferences with the design review board, but the project components that are shown in the exhibits to the development agreement, including building footprints and the basic configuration of open space on the site, cannot be modified by the design review board. So the gist is that this is a standard design review process in Kirkland, but some of the fundamental design elements in the project are fixed by the development agreement. And it's also a very standard environmental review process. Keep in mind that we've already conducted environmental review for an envelope of development in the station area plan that encompasses what Google is already proposing. So the expectation is that when Google applies for its project, no additional environmental review is necessary, because we actually, again, want development to happen in the station area plan. And with that in mind, we are planning in the coming weeks to adopt a planned action ordinance similar in look and feel to what was adopted for Kirkland Urban that would identify specific mitigation measures that would apply to the Google project, precluding the need for any additional environmental review for the project unless the project changes in a way that would generally require special city council approval as a major amendment to the project. We've talked earlier about that provision in the form-based code that encourages development agreements to be negotiated for projects on larger sites. And that provision also states that if there is a development agreement, variations to development code provisions other than those governing height and use are okay as long as the project can be designed in accordance with the specifics of the site, the sort of the physical limitations of the site. The variations to the existing code as it would be applied to this project are listed at the very top of this slide, and they include that the precise locations of 2 mid-block crossings can be modified during the design review process. Larger floor plates are allowed that taper and get narrower as you go up in height in the buildings. Instead of a 15-foot landscape buffer around the King County Housing Authority site, we're getting a 20-foot setback with a row of trees to provide screening along the King County Housing Authority site. Setbacks are measured from property lines, not the edge of future right-of-way dedications, which are still a little bit in flux right now, to provide Google with the design certainty it needs to move the project forward, while still ensuring a very high-quality public frontage along 85th and 120th. And then the last bullet sort of at the top says, talks about how we measure building height. It's a little technical. This outlines a relatively customized approach to measuring the base height elevation for the Eastern Pavilion building in the development, where the base elevation will be measured at a point to the east of that pavilion instead of average across the entire project site, which is typically how we measure base elevation. And again, this is just a reflection of the very steep topography as you move south over the project site. And then at the very bottom, we talk about project changes. There are mechanisms for project changes. Basically, the very big moves, like increases in the volume or scale of development or things that would diminish the public benefits identified in the development agreement, would require city council approval. And minor changes, such as those having to do with project phasing, for instance, would be approved by the planning and building department. Now we come to vesting standards, vesting provisions. These vesting provisions are very typical of other development agreements across the state and probably across the country. They basically say that the municipal code, the zoning code, and design regulations that are in place when the development agreement is effective govern the overall project, but building, fire, energy, and other technical codes, permit processing fees, and impact fees are applied to the project at the time when there's a complete building permit application. And there are some limited exceptions for situations where, for instance, towers are built above a podium that was subject to older versions of the building code. No changes to that podium would be required to comply with the new building code unless needed for life or safety reasons. And that's vesting, and now I will hand it off to Deputy City Manager Dunlap to talk about a really fundamental part of the development agreement, which is the community benefits and amenities that Google commits to building.
Thank you, Adam, and good evening, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of the City Council. The next few slides are going to just speak briefly to the community benefits and amenities that are incorporated in the development agreement, with a few illustrations to help put them into context. If you recall, when we talked about the incentive zoning program, basically the purpose of that program is a voluntary program for development to be able to provide additional community benefits for additional height for the project. And in this case, as the Planning and Building Director highlighted earlier, as we negotiated the agreement, our direction was that we needed to make sure that the community amenities meet or exceeded what's required in the form-based code. And so there are a few categories of amenities that are incorporated in the agreement, and then I'll show you an illustration of how we believe they exceed the requirements of the form-based code. At this point, there are a number of open space features, the important part being that they are open to the public. They are bicycle and pedestrian connections and open space that would provide a great deal of public access to the site, both in a multimodal transportation sense, but also in a community gathering sense. And so in the presentation last week, there were highlights of what each of these features are, but for the sake of time, the intent of showing this graphic is that there's substantial space set aside in the development site plan for public amenities so that it will integrate better with the community and provide opportunities that aren't necessarily there for the public today. That was one element that's very performance-based in the features. The second element, if maybe you can go back to the prior slide, Adam. Oh, sorry, yeah, the prior one. The second piece was the community benefit payment, the incentive amenity payment, which the city intends to use for affordable housing, which is basically a cash payment that is committed to investment in affordable housing in Kirkland. And it reflects an absolute limit on the total square footage for office uses on the site, above which it would be a major change to the agreement. And that payment was put together based on looking at what might have been required on the site if it were developed as multifamily, and looking at various approaches to setting that amount. And in a few moments, we'll talk about, or maybe right here is a good place to talk about, that there is basically an upfront payment of that $12.46 million at the time of the issuance of the first building permit. So basically, early in the process, the full amount is paid. But the intent of that full amount being paid up front is to allow it to go to work as quickly as possible, and to also recognize that over time, the cost of affordable housing will go up. Given that there are 5 phases to the project, the first 3 of which are expected to be built in fairly quick succession, the podium and the first 2 buildings, but then there are 2 later phases, phases 4 and 5, that if phases 4 and 5 don't proceed, the 40% of that payment is refundable to Google. The other element that is tied to this is the extension of the term, which is the 5-year extension is granted after the issuance of that building permit and the payment of this fee, so that we can ensure that the first part of the project is moving forward. So if you go forward to the next one, thank you. We tried to put the community benefits and amenities into the framework that we use to talk about the incentive zoning program. So the graphic on the right was the hypothetical example of the amenities that a developer might choose to get up to the 150 feet in capacity. And in this illustration, the hypothetical 150-foot development made a payment for affordable housing and built an outdoor plaza. To put the amenities into context that are incorporated into the development agreement as it's presented, is in both cases, the base zoning requires certain performance, but the building itself, at this point, the intent is to build it using mass timber, which has a 180-foot limit. And what you can see is that the amount of space dedicated to the outdoor plazas, the mid-block transportation connections, and then the affordable housing payment not only exceed what is necessary to that mass timber height limit, but it also exceeds the 250-foot amount that would be required under the form-based code. And so the interesting aspect of this is that the amenities that are defined in those 3 categories exceed what would be required under the form-based code. And there are amenities that Google is either intending to do or is in discussions to do that would add on top of that. And so the final slide on this part of the discussion is to talk about other community benefits that we didn't size for purposes of meeting or exceeding the requirements of the code, but that are recognized in the development agreement, particularly related to sustainability. And one of the requirements in the base is that Google will need to meet the current high performance building code, and will need to meet the minimum green factor included in the base zoning. But Google will endeavor to do a variety of enhanced sustainability features that are described in some detail in the attachment to the development agreement, Exhibit E, but then include being 100% electric, using mass timber, which is a sustainable construction material in all the office towers, very aggressively pursuing transportation demand management to reduce vehicle trips, and then to basically be highly sustainable in all of its utility elements, including solid waste by a landfill diversion rate and how they reuse water on the site and things of that nature. And so while all of those could be scored under the incentive zoning, at this early stage in the design process, that was challenging, and just the amenities that I talked about on the prior slide exceed the requirements of the form-based code. And I just wanted to highlight that while the incentive zoning program includes the potential to choose school spaces, those are not factored in to this analysis either. However, Google is working with Lake Washington School District to identify and pursue partnership opportunities. They've met already. I know they intend to meet again. And both parties are interested in finding ways to work together to help meet the school's needs within the space that Google is planning. And so I think at this point, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Joel Funt, our transportation manager.
Just one second, Tracy. I see a question from Councilmember Pascal.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So apologize to my fellow colleagues, but been having to do a crash course of the development agreement today. For those that aren't aware, I've been gone for several weeks, so I'm not up to speed on everything as much as I would like. I had a question around the affordable housing fee, the 12.5 million. I recognize that that's a voluntary fee. I'm sure that there's been a ton of discussion and back and forth behind the scenes that we're not privy to arrive at that number. The thing that's on my mind is ultimately it's about building affordable housing units, number of units, right? And so, normally with a residential development, it's 10%, oftentimes in our commercial zones, 10% of the units have to be affordable. So you quickly kind of can do the math. You can go, okay, so if someone builds 200 units, you're going to get 20 units of affordable units. In this case, the 12.5 million, I don't know how to equate it to units. And the fact that housing costs are increasing significantly and have increased significantly just in the last few years, and that's probably only going to get worse, particularly if this payment isn't made for 2-3 years. How are we capturing those increased housing costs so that we're still getting the number of units that ultimately we're expecting?
So maybe I'll give a brief answer as to how we arrived at the number, and then I can see if Adam or the city manager want to embellish. What we did is we looked at if the site under the existing zoning had developed as housing, which it had the option to develop as, how many units might we expect to be developed, and then how many affordable units would be included, to come up with kind of a gross sizing. And then we looked at a payment per unit that falls in a range of the costs. I think that by trying to accelerate the payment with the first building permit, so that would be the soonest that the payment would be made, that allows us to invest it so that we can have the most buying power over time. But because they're making the payment that's based on essentially the full program, the 5 phases, that's why there was a refund provision incorporated in that. The intent in the language in the development agreement is that it would be invested in projects in Kirkland, certainly with the intent of it being invested in the station area. And so how it would actually be deployed will be dependent on what projects are moving forward and would be requesting funding from the city via Arch toward that. But we did actually go through and look at different methods of coming up with this. And again, the community benefit payment, the decision is really the city's to use it toward affordable housing, but that was our intent. And I think that was consistent with Google's intent as well. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but
Yeah,
Let me.
yeah. Thank you, Tracy. I know it's a difficult question to answer. I obviously don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's a curiosity. I'm sure I would imagine others kind of have a question of what the 12.5 million buys from an affordable housing perspective, and how, as we use more of these voluntary agreements, perhaps in other areas of the station area, how are we tracking and capturing the increased costs that it takes to build those units, and then factoring that into future agreements, right? Because this is voluntary, it's negotiated. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for, is making sure that we have a consistent, sustainable way of assuring that we're achieving the number of units that we ultimately expect from this voluntary monetary transfer. So, thank you.
City Manager, did you want to add something?
Well, just very quickly, a similar question was asked by Councilmember Black at the last meeting, and it's a great question. So there's a variety of ways we're thinking about investing this money. One of the things I would mention is that the money that we invest through ARCH as local governments generally gets about a 9 or 10 to 1 leverage of county and state money. So just using rough math as an example, if we invested this $12 million in an ARCH project, you might get a $100 million affordable housing project. Another just quick rule of thumb, the Inland project, it's a Horizon project up at the former Buick dealership site. It's by Fred Meyer. They spent $20 million to purchase that land, but they're going to build about 350 all affordable units of 50% of median income or less. There's a couple slightly higher, including some for those experiencing homelessness. So what we intend to do is look at various options and bring it back to the council. Those options could include, for example, buying into a project in the station area and buying down units so that their income level goes down, or asking a developer to build more. The second thing we're looking at is the potential for using housing on the Houghton Park and Ride site, should we acquire it, because we'll have that as something that's in the city's control. And then finally, we've also looked at the idea of, since we just acquired the Houghton Village site, that might be something that we do in a partnership with a variety of partners, but also there. So we really want to obviously maximize that, but there's still a lot of different options that can be brought back to the council for action.
Councilmember Black.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to ask Deputy City Manager Dunlap a question that I think will help clarify. Since our study session last week, I think some of us have seen some discussion on social media, and if we could go to the slide that shows the building heights for illustrative purposes. Yeah, I think there's an understandable misunderstanding about what this slide depicts, and it's been commented on social media, and then as things tend to do, they get picked up and discussed and disseminated. I just wanted to ask you, Deputy City Manager Dunlap, if you could clarify, the illustration here is not meant to demonstrate that Google can build towers taller than 250 feet.
Correct. The zoning code defines the 250-foot limit, and in fact, the technology that is the current plan would limit the structures to 180 feet. What this was intended to illustrate is that broad objective that the community benefits and amenities that are being provided as part of the development agreement meet or exceed what would be required by the code. And so if we didn't do the development agreement and the development was happening at the 250-foot form-based code limit, it wouldn't require as much of this investment as we are getting from the development agreement. And so I think in your deliberations with the Planning Commission, they were talking about, for the higher heights, I think the word they used was monumental community benefits. And while I'm not attempting to define monumental specifically, what I think these are intended to relay is that the community benefits and amenities that are being included in the development significantly exceed what the form-based code would require. So they are substantially more than 150-foot building on that location would be required to do for that 150 feet. Does that clarify?
Thank you. I think that's a great clarification. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Super, you can proceed.
All right, on to Jewel Fund.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, City Council, City Manager. So I'm going to be going over some of the transportation-related sections. And so first, the vehicle parking section, which was a source of a lot of conversation in the development agreement. And so what Google will be doing is constructing parking consistent with the form-based code standard for the first 3 phases of the development at 2 spots per 1,000 square feet of commercial use. And since that is already a rather ambitious goal, they will also be implementing a transportation demand management program and a transportation management plan. And then during phases 4 and 5, the goal is, or Google's goal is to demonstrate that they do not need additional parking as part of those phases. The city can decline to approve a lower parking ratio if Google can't demonstrate that they are able to meet that lower parking ratio. And as part of that, they would then provide additional parking as part of phase 4 and 5 at that 2 spots per 1,000 rate. Or the city may approve a lower parking ratio as low as 1 spot per 1,000 square feet of commercial. And as part of that, Google would be doing an enhanced transportation demand management program and would be doing ongoing monitoring on the site of their parking utilization and then also offsite. And if there were issues with offsite parking based on the utilization studies showing that there was an increase in offsite parking, Google would implement short-term parking signage to address those utilizations in the surrounding neighborhoods, and then continue to work to bring those parking ratios into compliance. And then ultimately, there is another solution where Google would fund half of a parking enforcement officer to help with compliance until they are back within their parking ratio. Another issue is pickup and drop off areas. They have noted 3 areas where they would have pickup and drop off 2 along 120th Avenue and 1 along 118th Avenue. And those, since we're very early in design, would be subject to the final approval under the requirements that are shown in Exhibit G. And then next slide, thanks. With vehicular access, there would be 1 vehicular access off of Northeast 85th Street. That would be a right in, right out, and it would be much in basically the same location as the existing Lee Johnson driveway. And that would serve specifically Google's new transit hub that would provide a lot of the alternative transit, private transit shuttles and stuff like that Google will be providing. And then on 120th Avenue Northeast, they will be providing their primary signalized access. And the basic kind of starting point for the general alignment of that access is at Northeast 83rd Street. But the city and Google will work during the phase 1 design to see if that can be adjusted north and still have 120th Avenue function properly, and that's something that Google would like to see happen. And then the other access on 120th Avenue Northeast is a service vehicle entrance, and that would access 120th right at the south edge of the Google parcel. Then there would be vehicular access off of 118th Avenue Northeast, and this is dependent on what happens with the parking for phase 4 and 5. If there is not parking constructed as part of phase 4 and 5, then the access of 118th Avenue would be purely for emergency in nature. But if there were additional parking built as part of phase 4 and 5, that would provide access, those phases would get access from 118th Avenue Northeast. And then related to that, there is potential latecomers agreements, a latecomer agreement that Google could seek to put those in place with the city, and that is accommodated in the agreement. And so from a transportation infrastructure perspective, these are so many of the major projects that that Google will be building and the phase under which they will be building them. So the Northeast 85th Street pedestrian bike path along their frontage will be built as part of phase 1, as well as the improvements at Northeast 85th Street and 120th Avenue Northeast. And that will include an additional eastbound right turn lane and implementing a second, basically when it's done, it'll have dual northbound left turn lanes. There will be the traffic signal at 120th Avenue Northeast and the main commuter vehicle site entrance. They will be doing some frontage improvements along 120th along the site. And then south of the site to 180th, the Google will be rechannelizing that site, that section, and adding a southbound bike lane and a center two-way left turn lane, which will then transition into a southbound left turn lane at the intersection with Northeast 80th Street, where Google will be completely rebuilding that that signalized intersection, which is not only needs some improvement to make it all the new design work, but is also one of our older signals in the city. And so then the other thing that as part of phase 1, Google will be constructing a two-way protected bike path along 118th Avenue Northeast. And that will connect in with something that's not shown on the slide, which is the new ped bike path that will extend from across the site to Northeast 85th Street. And then as part of phase 2 and 3, Google will be wrapping up the 120th frontage improvements and constructing the 120th pickup and drop off areas. And then as part of phase 4 and 5, the 118th pickup and drop off area will be built. And then this specific additional improvements on 118th and at the 118th and 80th intersection will be once again dependent on the final conclusion of how much parking is provided on the site. And then for transportation impact fees, they will be calculated per the impact fee schedule in effect at the time of the building permit application. That will be subject to a possible independent calculation. And then they will be provided some credits for some of the system improvements that Google will be making, but not all. And those specific projects where they get credit against their impact fees are noted in Exhibit F. Concurrency, we're looking this, particularly with transportation concurrency, as a phase development per code, and then additionally, concurrency test notice for, and then for concurrency itself, the that we will be basically reserving all of the trips for the entire project, all of the peak hour person trips for the project as part of the site. And that is approximately 2,300 trips that they will be reserving for the site. And then they will be basically get those trips as part of, they will reserve those trips as part of each phase of the development as it goes along. And with that, I'll hand it over, I believe, to John Burkhalter to talk about the water and sewer.
I see a question from Councilmember Pascal.
Madam Mayor. Mayor, a question for you. I have a number of questions about transportation. Do you want to save those for after the public hearing or ask them now?
Will we have an opportunity after the public hearing to?
Yeah, there can be a discussion after a public hearing, so I think that might be.
Yeah, let's wait and
best way
do
to do it.
those after so we can get to public comment.
Great, thanks.
We're almost.
Thank you. Water sewer concurrency. So the project. will
John,
be-
hold on, please, for a second.
How much longer we're going to see yet another presentation from the city of Kirkland without allowing, I know you don't care what I have to say, but I think I should be given that opportunity. And you will be. I'd like to know how much longer, sir, that this presentation is going to take.
Yeah, there's just about 3 slides left, and it should be wrapped up in a couple minutes.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Water and sewer concurrency. So the project will meet water concurrency. The provisions that the buildings provide fire sprinklers per code. Upgrade to the sewer system. It will meet concurrency for sewer with some upgrades to the sewer system, which I will cover on this next slide. So as I stated, no water projects are needed to meet fire flow needs for the project or domestic needs. Sewer infrastructure. So with phase 1, there's a portion of the project SAP 7, which needs to upsize from 8-inch to 12-inch on segment D, which is a 400-foot section that's on 120th down near Costco. And the project will also do a portion of SAP 6, or actually SAP 6, which would be a relocation, but as part of the stationary plan modeling was deemed to need to be upsized. So the project will move the sewer and the city will pay the incremental cost to upgrade it from 8-inch to 12-inch. Any question?
I see none. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just wrap it up really quickly. Just 2 more slides, 3 more slides. This slide here just comprises mostly legal provisions. I won't review in a lot of detail. The one thing I'll just call out is that the term of the agreement can be extended another 5 years, so from 10 to 15 years when there's a complete structural building permit application made for the first phase and the community benefit incentive payment has been made, but the base term is 10 years. Oops. Oh, that's it. And then next steps, just before you open up the hearing, we plan to bring back this development agreement for council consideration on July 19th, and that will be a hybrid meeting. Folks, of course, are welcome to comment at the beginning of the meeting during the items from the audience section, but tonight is really the best time to comment on the development agreement. And if council has any other questions, our team is here to answer them. If not, I'll close the PowerPoint.
I think we're good to go. Okay, I would like now to invite Google as the other party to the proposed development agreement to make remarks it wishes to related to the development agreement briefly. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor Arnold, and members of the City Council. Ian Goodhue here on behalf of Google. Thank you for the opportunity to present last week. I'll keep it short tonight. Again, the city staff presented both what the city will receive from the proposed development agreement and, of course, what Google will receive. We'll receive development certainty. We'll be able to move forward with a slightly larger floor plate and some additional modifications to the setbacks and other zoning in the form-based code. What Google hopes to deliver and plans to deliver in our community benefits are exactly what the staff just went through. The open public space, the bike and pedestrian trails, including essentially all the way around the campus to hopefully encourage as much pedestrian and bike traffic as possible, get people out of their cars. In addition to that, of course, are the transportation mitigation measures that Mr. Funt went through to minimize the traffic impact. We have our aggressive transportation goals, as I went over last week, about getting, again, people out of their cars, not driving to and from the campus in single occupancy vehicles. And then, of course, the community incentive payment to support affordable housing. We hope to continue to support that effort, obviously, even after making that payment. The one thing I did forget to mention last week in detail was touched on already, but I'll just emphasize it again. We're in serious discussions with the Lake Washington School District on how we can partner when it comes to both programming so that our employees can interact with the students more, particularly those students who are obviously interested in technology field and STEM, but then also use of space on the campus as well to support the school district. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and we would ask that after hearing from the public that you approve the development agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the council for Mr. Goodhue? With that, I will now call upon any members of the public who have signed up to address the council. We generally do not limit the length. I'm not going to do that because we're not going to limit the length tonight unless we get an overwhelming influx of folks who want to talk to us. So right now, I think we're at how many?
Currently, we have 7 speakers, and the first one was Ian.
Excellent. So let's proceed, and Kathy will call the list.
All right, the first person signed up is Brian Buck, to be followed by Sharon Cox, Colleen Clement, Sue Amorosi, Lori Hansen, and Daniel Weiss.
Welcome again, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Brian Buck. I'm the Executive Director of Support Services at the Lake Washington School District. The school district has been working collaboratively with the city staff over the last year and has been closely monitoring the work on the 85th Street station. We appreciate the City Council's direction early on that school capacity be a key consideration in the planning principles. In addition, we have met with Google multiple times to discuss their growing presence in Kirkland and how their company can provide benefit to the school district, as the growth in employment opportunities will correlate to growth in student enrollment in our district. We are excited about the possibilities for partnership with Google and the benefits this will provide students, families, and the community. We also know that as commercial development increases within the community, it serves to increase the tax base, which should in turn reduce the tax burden on individual homeowners. This factor is welcomed and appreciated. At the same time, we also know that finding physical locations for school programs is challenging and that creative partnerships are needed to assure that school capacity can be provided where it's most needed and where it can best complement the implementation of the station plan. We appreciate the efforts Google has made to collaborate and their commitment to continue discussions with the school district regarding the development of the Lee Johnson site and how that development can incorporate space for student learning. Given the magnitude of this project, we believe there should be a requirement or reference regarding collaboration with the school district. Just to provide some perspective, 1.5 million square feet of office space is roughly equivalent to the square footage of 18 elementary schools. We believe it would be helpful for the development agreement to include this element in recognition of school service needs. We believe that strategic partnerships will lead to creating livable communities and places that are desirable for our parents and residents. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Sharon Cox.
Welcome, Ms. Cox.
Thank you so much. Good evening, Mayor Sweet and council members. My name is Sharon Cox. I'm a 20-year resident of the Moss Bay neighborhood. My address is 638 Kirkland Way, Unit 4, Kirkland, 98033. I'm thankful that we finally are able to address you in person. I have written to the Planning Commission and to you folks several times about the last 2 years about this project and my
Sharon,
concerns.
Sharon, can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, sorry. I've written to you several times over the last couple of years about my concerns on this project. And my biggest concern at this point is that there is no requirement in the development plan regarding the revised tree code that Mayor Sweet signed into law on March 15th of 2022. I'm going to read to you from the tree code that you folks agreed to just a couple months ago. 1, purpose and intent. 1, trees and other vegetation are important elements of the physical environment. They are integral to Kirkland's community character and protect public health, safety, and general welfare. Protecting, enhancing, and maintaining healthy trees and vegetation are key community values. Comprehensive Plan Policy NE 3.1 describes working towards achieving a healthy, resilient urban forest with a citywide tree canopy of 40%. The many benefits of healthy trees and vegetation contribute to Kirkland's quality of life. Purpose and intent number 2, C. Promote site planning, building, and development practices that work to avoid removal or destruction of trees and vegetation, that avoid unnecessary disturbance to the city's natural vegetation, and that provide landscaping to buffer the effects of built and paved areas. So I looked up what the definition of citywide means in Merriam-Webster, and citywide means including or involving all parts of the city. So citywide doesn't mean that the trees in Juanita count for the trees in North Rose Hill, okay? That's not what that means. Citywide does not mean that the city can just ignore a 40% tree canopy law just because Google doesn't want to provide it. Citywide means exactly that, including and involving all parts of the city. There are also many large fir trees on the Lee Johnson site, and the proposed development allows Google to cut down these trees if they want. And this needs to be revised in this plan. And also the March 2022 tree code states new development will not remove or destroy trees. Further, the code states new development should provide at least 40% tree canopy. The proposed development plan does not even address the tree code and appears to be in violation of this law. So I would request that this tree canopy, this tree code law that you just implemented in March be included in this development plan. The proposed development agreement allows Google to build on 90% of the property. The proposed agreement allows Google to provide a 5-foot landscape buffer instead of the new rezone code of 15 feet. I understand Google needs an emergency lane to service their buildings. Why is this lane coming out of the 15-foot landscape buffer? Why is Google not required to take this from the development side of their property and still provide the 15-foot buffer that you just voted into law? The proposed agreement allows Google to have larger building platforms than allowed by the recently passed rezoning laws. The proposed agreement allows Google to build up to 250 feet, 100 feet higher than any other property in the area. For the last 2 years, I have seen our city, the Planning Commission, and the City Council bend over backwards to give Google everything they want. Why has there been no pushback? Why didn't you all tell Google that the height limit is 150 feet? Why didn't you all tell Google that they need to provide 40% tree canopy? Why didn't you all tell Google they need to reduce the size of their building platforms? There has been absolutely no negotiations with Google on any of these issues. Why? Why are you all letting Google call the shots on this? Why are you letting Google, the first developer under your new rezone laws, have all these exceptions? I don't understand it. I honestly don't. You're not very good negotiators. I used to negotiate for a living, and I can tell you, you needed to negotiate some of these things instead of just giving carte blanche, giving them everything they wanted. Okay. As an aside, I would like to point out to Google and to the City Council that other major corporations with hybrid workers are having employees share desk space as cost-saving measures. Google could easily house 7,000 additional hybrid workers in their 6th Street campus and the Kirkland urban campus if they shared office space. It does not make dollars and cents to me that Google wants to spend billions building more office space when it is not necessary in today's current hybrid work environment. Further, even if Google insists on developing the Lee Johnson site, they do not need 3 large office towers to house 7,000 people who can easily share desks and office space. This would allow Google to provide the 40% tree canopy on the Lee Johnson property as required by law. Back to my other concerns. Why have my tax dollars paid for 2 years of city employees' salaries to give Google everything they want? Why have my tax dollars paid for $1 million outside consultant traffic study that you all have ignored? Why are you upgrading the sewer system, which you state is not necessary at taxpayer expense? Mayor Sweet says that if the city has to pay back $5 million to Google, she will put it in the city budget. Well, again, so the taxpayers will be asked to foot that bill. Google is a $1 trillion corporation who can afford all of the above rather than shoving it off on Kirkland citizens' tax bill. I also believe the Planning Commission and Kirkland City Council are in violation of the Washington State Fairness Doctrine. It is clear to me that you are not impartial government panel as required by Washington state laws. 2 of the Planning Commission members are Google employees. Mayor Sweet, no disrespect to either of you, Mayor Sweet and Councilman Black were absolutely giddy at the July 6th hearing to just sign over the whole development. You can rewatch it. You can see how you guys looked. None of you, save Councilman Nixon, has been impartial on any of this. You have not responded to me about my 40% tree canopy request, except to say my comments will be passed along. No one has ever gotten back to me as to why you're violating the tree code, why you're not including the tree code in your development plan. You haven't responded to any citizen concerns about schools. You have failed to get back to the Kirkland Neighborhood Alliance. They kept stalling. You've never gotten back to them on most of their concerns. As far as the traffic, you basically say, yeah, Mr. Triplett said the other night, yeah, well, we know that the citizens are complaining about traffic. We need to look at that. I heard nothing to do with the traffic that's going to be caused by this project. So, in other words, but you've bent over backwards to give Google everything they want, okay? So, and you failed to address citizen concerns. And so these actions are not impartial in any way. These actions, I mean, obviously, you're giving everything that Google wants. You're giving them everything. And you haven't even sent me a letter to explain why you're not following your own tree code. So, in other words, you are in violation of the Washington State Fairness Doctrine. And I firmly believe that. And I think I can pretty much proved it right tonight. And I also know that my comments today are going to be totally ignored, just like they've been for the last 2 years. You don't really care what the public thinks about any of this, what long-term Kirkland citizens think about any of this. It used to be, it used to be that locals would have some input into city government actions. I already know that the individual, I can't affect any state or federal changes at all, but it used to be maybe someone might actually listen to local people. But I can see that locals no longer have a voice in city government either. I am sorely disappointed that you are letting a $1 trillion corporation dictate what happens to this wonderful city that I have lived in for the last 20 years. I thank you for your time tonight. I'm Sharon Cox, and I really do look forward to hearing from you on the tree canopy issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Colleen Clement, and she's virtual.
Thank you.
She'll be followed by Sue Amorosi.
Yes, I'm going to come in as audio only. Can you hear me well?
We can, Colleen.
Excellent. Hi. I think many of you might know me, but I am Colleen Clement. I'm a resident of Kirkland, and I'm also on the leadership team for the People for Climate Action. PCA for the Kirkland area. And I'm also a member of the Kirkland's Environmental Technical Advisory Group, the ETAG group. And I was involved in the development of the Sustainability Master Plan. So I wanted to start by saying that I recognize the exceptional effort and the deliverables to date for numerous people within the city, including the city council, city management, the planning department, planning commission, project contractors, and Google regarding this once-in-a-generation project for the 85th Street area. I view it as being a very impressive effort and something that sets yet another high standard for Kirkland. Of extreme importance to me is the major consideration for sustainability and the goals and targets of the Sustainability Master Plan in both the overall plan as well as the development agreement that is before us today. Given this, I support the majority of the agreement with a few exceptions. I especially support the sustainability portion that pertains to compliance with the recently adopted high-performance building standards, the LEED Platinum standard, and going with the most current building codes and energy codes for the state that will be accepted at the time of permit, which is critical because those are now in deep negotiation. So I think the timing on that is going to be very critical. Given this, I support all the above with the one exception, which has to do with the statement regarding 100% electric buildings. So I noted that on that one Exhibit E, I believe it is, says that they will comply with these things, including the green factor. However, in the second section, the language says they will intend to, which is different than fully commit to. So from my perspective, given where we are in the transition from fossil fuel to electricity, something of this magnitude, especially one that is so far reaching into the future and is set as a catalyst project, should come out of the gate as 100% commitment of all electric buildings. So that's really where I think the crux of the matter is on that. So from my perspective, I really think we're going to be behind the curve if we don't actually have it be a requirement that all the buildings for this project be 100% electric. That's really my main focus for today. I want to again thank everyone for what they've done and look forward to this amazing project. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sue Amorosi, and she is on site.
Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Well, hello, Mayor Penny Sweet and council members. I'm Sue Amorosi, live on 11th Avenue West, and I've been there for about 33 years. And my interest, I've had an interest in, I've liked the idea of concentrated development to prevent urban sprawl most of my life. And I wanted to talk about open space and pedestrian bike lanes mainly. And I think in the past 33 years, one of the designs or things that have been built in Kirkland that I find very well done is the Google campus, the collaboration, the public-private collaboration of the CKC at the Google campus, and because it was well designed and it has a variety of ages using it, and volleyball, the playground, the movable furniture, and I see that Google plans to do something, and I just hope that some open spaces are better designed than others. So I think that as a council, you should require that their plan is reviewed by you, not just give them a free rein of building an open space, because some open spaces are a lot more interesting than others. So I would hope that they would hire an excellent urban landscape architect, as they did, at the CKC, and I hope that Kirkland will review the plan to make sure that it is as interesting as what's down there. And as far as it's great to see there's so many bike pedestrian pathways, on the major streets and going through the Google campus. I think we need to keep them divided, even through more green space places. The Arboretum is an example of, it's just, everybody's supposed to get along with everybody, but we don't have eyes in the back of our head, and we're walking, and people are passing. And I think that going forward, I think if we have the space and the money, and we have the space and the money, we should divide out the bike and pedestrian, require that as something that needs to be done. And I encourage you, I think it was a great idea, whoever came up with it, to require, added benefit for higher height. I don't know what you call it, the incentives, but just keep thinking of ways of using zoning to improve the quality of life of citizens in our area. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next three speakers are virtual. The first one is Lori Hanson, followed by Daniel Weiss, Curtis Brown, and then on site is Liz Hunt.
Are you there, Lori?
Okay. I'm Laurie Hanson. I lived in Kirkland for about 50 years. I'd like to address several issues related to this development agreement. First of all, traffic and parking. Google is creating a systemic traffic disaster for us. Buildings that Google has already built and launched, such as Urban and the new Houghton buildings, are not fully populated, but they will be. The Seattle Times says that Google has not released the employee population projections for those campuses. Discussion in the July 6th meeting only addressed Lee Johnson's site. Kirkland does not have the infrastructure to support traffic for such massive development. Everest neighbors report that Google employees are parking on their campus, parking on their neighborhood streets. They accept the incentive to not drive to work and simply park off campus, negatively impacting the surrounding neighborhood. We can expect more of the same at the new location. Joel Funt, the Transportation Commission Chair, says the development agreement has suggestions for Google to be held accountable to police that offsite parking, but for the sake of the neighborhoods, we need evidence that Google will follow through. If Google is planning for rotational access to the buildings, then why do they need such huge presence in the city and so much space? Let's be clear, open, and factual about the traffic. By their own numbers, 82% of non-Kirkland resident Google employees drive single occupancy vehicles today. The city's consultant did an inadequate job on the traffic study, and the Planning Commission has repeatedly requested a broader study be done. We are requesting that Google fund a national traffic study to ensure that we have accurate data. Regarding equity and inclusion, Google currently employs 30% women across their entire employee population. The largest employer in Kirkland will have a negative impact on gender equity in our city, a hugely negative impact on overall culture and job opportunities. We need to raise awareness around this. Google's communication strategy with the public, let me address that. Google has not been in front of the public regarding this development since November of 2021, contrary to what Ian Goodhue stated in the 7-6 presentation. In fact, we were told not to even mention the name Google. We talked about it at the last few public meetings. Jay Arnold, our deputy mayor, suggested that they do a open house and requested Google do that. The ensuing event, which was held today prior to this meeting, had virtually no public notice, and even those intimately involved with the project didn't know about it until late last week. We request that you hold a real open house with proper preparation, inviting the public to your space to talk with the developers in a model that was used by the initial developers of Kirkland Urban. Design issues. On the one hand, we're told 180 feet is the maximum for mass timber. But Ian mentioned in the 7.6 presentation that they would likely not be going beyond 210. This is 15 to 17 stories. We need clarity, we need transparency. Where are the rooftop parks that we were shown in every schematic? Every presentation discussed public access to Google rooftop parks. Suddenly, these are completely absent from Google's latest presentation. They have rooftop availability at their CKC site, which they do not allow access to. The city's creating and conferring the best views and the most valuable property in Kirkland upon Google. And Kirklanders get no access. What they get is a traffic nightmare. The city's given Google potentially this most valuable piece of property in Kirkland with this height, 1.5 million square feet of space, equivalent to Bellevue's Lincoln Square. This new space at Lee Johnson will have the best views in Kirkland, and we're allowing the highest buildings in the city with unobstructed views of the lake, as the freeway is in front of the view, so they can't be blocked, unlike much of the residential space in Kirkland, which we allow to be blocked by trees and other buildings. What an incredible acquisition for Google. We request that they share that wonderful amenity with the public. That concession doesn't even begin to counter the value, but it would be something to give back to the residents, as we'll be subject to the inevitable consequences of building this project in a space with inadequate infrastructure. Years of construction, ongoing traffic and parking negative impacts, lack of sufficient green space, crowded schools. In a catch-22, many of the characteristics of Kirkland that make it so attractive to Google employees will soon be gone. We are not asking enough in return for the value that Google is getting. Thank you. That concludes my comments.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Daniel Wise, followed by Curtis Brown and Liz Hunt.
Hello, thank you for letting me join you. I'm Daniel Wise. I've been a resident of Kirkland for 25 years, live in the Silver Spruce area. I viewed the tapes, the recordings from the prior study session, and I think this is just totally fabulous. Google's clearly giving you a lot in return for what's going on, and we need to have the high density employment and the high density residents, all the residences involved in this one, next to the major transportation corridors. So putting it there is totally win-win. Everything I've seen, I'm totally supportive of. Yes, traffic's going to be an issue, but putting it next to the freeway is a serious win. So as a Kirkland resident, thank you all for working so hard on this. Thank you for putting it all together. Clearly there's more details to be worked out, but so far I'm liking what I'm seeing, and thank you all for your hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Wise.
The next speaker is Curtis Brown, followed by Liz Hunt.
All right. Can you hear me?
Welcome, Mr. Brown.
Hi, Curtis Brown, of course, living on 118th, representing the neighbors here to the south of the current Lee Johnson property. Couple items here that are needed to go over on this 100-page document, which was sent out on Friday. And of course, expected the public to find that on Friday night and be responding to it by Monday evening. Definitely in line with the rest of the checkbox attempts by Adam Weinstein's team to inform the public and get feedback. Absolutely ridiculous, but I wanted to deal with a couple things here. First is that there are a number of soft aspects to this agreement without any actual penalties for violation that would mean something to Google. So I ask that when we go through here, there are just a number of things that give them a bunch of kind of, let's call it squishiness into what they would have to adhere to and what the penalties would be if they did not. So there's a couple of aspects I'll talk to, but ask throughout this that you guys make this enforceable, as again, this seems to be like the rest of the Google agreement that Kirk Triplets mandated get rushed through. The gift plan should be finished before it's actually finalized and signed off on. The first big thing I want to talk is the community benefit amount. Wow, $12 million sure seems like a nice big number, though, as was referred to earlier, it doesn't specify exactly what does that mean in terms of affordable housing? We know what 7,000 additional of the highest paid individuals in the nation in a single block is going to do to the housing prices here, to the property taxes, forcing other people out of the home, aside from those of us that you've already targeted to force from our homes. We know what that's going to do. We don't know what $12 million is going to do, but we do know that it's roughly the equivalent to 40 Google employees' annual compensation. 40 out of 7,000. So that's roughly about 0.6% of their salary that they're going to have in there. They're giving towards affordable housing. That really just comes across as though as a marketing bribe, so that the city council and specifically Kirk Triplett can highlight just what a great citizen and great deal that they got. We actually need benefit from the gifts that you've given them in terms of the massive height, in terms of all the rest of the accommodations that you're giving here. And $12 million, 0.6% of the amount or basically people that they're putting in one block is not acceptable. That's a rounding error on our city's budget almost. And to be frank, it also in here, it doesn't specify that it even needs to go to affordable housing or where that affordable housing will go. That doesn't say it's going to be on 85th. So basically you force people out of this area because they're not rich enough. They don't buy expensive wine. We don't want their kind here. You're not saying where these people are going to go. Where exactly are these these affordable housing units going to go? Where is this money going to go? That needs to be specified. All right, then the deal with some of the parking has already been highlighted. The traffic information in here is exceedingly low, but we definitely applaud what Google ideal is in terms of what they're saying that they want. The numbers that they provided is not something that's being achieved anywhere. And it's also not a question, or it's a question in terms of, is that a worst case scenario? Is that an average scenario? Is that a best case scenario that they're proposing? But the issue is in terms of enforcement. Again, you're getting very squishy in terms of exactly what the cost to them is going to be if they violate. And one specific area has to do with your parking enforcement. You have currently in this agreement that Google is going to police themselves. They'll do their own assessment in terms of the street parking, as far as whether or not it's over 80% within unspecified times. Is that during a school year? Is that during vacation times? But Google should not be the one that's policing and reporting on exactly what the impact is to the parking around that. That needs to be something that they pay for and that an independent or city contractor does. And then when you talk about enforcement, again, it's not clear in terms of what it is that you're saying that's going to happen. Are you going to put up 2-hour parking? What does the enforcement look like? Where is it? What is in the end of this is hurting all of the people that live around here. They're the ones that are paying for what you're giving Google here. And there's nothing in here in terms of saying about what was discussed previously in terms of having residential parking passes so that they could park on the street and perhaps other people would need to pay or couldn't park on the street. That needs to be specified here, and there needs to be a penalty, clear penalty in terms of that is for the community's benefit as far as when they violate that. And then finally, also the landscape buffers, just comment here that you've got 20-foot setbacks. Let's be clear that that 200, potentially 250-foot building that they have on top of the hill is very close to multiple residential homes. And you've got 20 feet. That's basically from you guys to the audience. That is, or even 65 feet, which is probably from you to the other wall. That is nothing compared to having this massive building that you're allowing, this 200, potentially up to 250-foot building. So guys, let's look at, again, you've highlighted that you don't care about anyone's lives that live here, but I ask those few of you that still do to actually enforce some realistic kind of accommodations for the impact to the people that still live here, and that, you know, you're gonna have a hell of a time trying to force this out. Yeah, and that's the key issues are some other ones I'll be sending in email, but I gotta say, this is absurd. This is the first time speaking since you guys rubber stamped Kirk Triplett's plan. As was mentioned earlier, we have taxpayer dollars going towards paying for this process. You have a planning commission that twice over the course of 2 years told you that they're not justified to have this extreme heights in this area. You did not even spend one sentence discussing their recommendations. You simply went with the plan that Kirk Triplett has been jamming through for over 2 years. And actually, let's be clear, even before that, the original time they proposed, it was up to 5 stories up to 6 stories over residential. Commercial space, housing over commercial. So you've been told multiple times, you've ignored them. You've ignored multiple, well, basically overwhelming feedback in terms of the height, that the only people supporting this for the over 70% were people supporting it for housing. This isn't housing. You're going to negatively affect housing. You're going to be driving up prices. You're going to be obviously massively impacting traffic. And you're getting $12 million and a couple nice trails. That's not enough. Work for Kirkland, not for Google through Kirk Triplett. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker and the last person signed up to speak is Liz Hunt.
Welcome.
All right. Wow. I will take a deep breath. I suspect a few others are. This has been a very long process, and thank you, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor Arnold, and council members and staff for allowing us to speak this evening. A number of folks have touched on topics that I have on my list here, so I will try to modify and breeze through this. My name is Liz Hunt. I live on 8th Street West in Kirkland. I truly hope that this development brings good things to Kirkland. I know a lot of people here believe that it will, and I certainly hope so. I think there is the potential. I do have concerns about some aspects of the plan, and primarily, are the community benefits and the mitigations enough, which is a bit of a theme we're hearing tonight. The public learned last week that Google can build up to 1.54 million square feet on this property. Wow. That's all I have to say about that is wow. Okay, that's not all I have to say about it. I appreciated Google being here this afternoon to have their open house and answer some questions. I was disappointed that there were no concept drawings for the buildings, and was told that those aren't available at this time. But 1.4 million square feet is what the size of Lincoln Square's capacity, the 2 buildings at Lincoln Square and Bellevue. The Columbia Tower is about 1.54 million square feet, and this development at Lee Johnson is able to go to 1.54 million square feet. So that's big. We've known all along it was going to be big, but now we have a number. I've been concerned all along about the mobility grid in this area. Lincoln Square and Columbia Tower have a much more dense mobility grid than we do, so we have some significant work to do to support this project. I certainly hope that a lot of people are not going to drive their cars to this development, which would be great, but then that also leaves thousands of bicycles and pedestrians now flooding that area. So I sure hope that our little bike lanes and our crosswalks across how many gazillion lanes on Northeast 85th Street can actually move bikes and peds through that area. So that's a question. The incentive zoning, and I know we've heard Deputy City Manager, I think, Ms. Dunlap, say that Google is providing way beyond what's required for them. maybe the program wasn't strong enough if they're willing to go way beyond, to infinity and beyond. So that makes me wonder. But I also hope that the way the incentives are being calculated is accurate. Google is providing a 28,000 square foot plaza on the northeast portion of the property, which looks like, according to the concept drawings, will be lovely. And they earn 210,000 square feet of additional space for that plaza. And the way the drawing is done, the plaza goes right up to the edge of the street. And I had contacted planner Ms. Zeich to ask about that. And apparently any of the required sidewalks and stuff will be not included in the incentive calculation. But the way it's in the document now, it doesn't look that way. So I hope that's clarified. I'm also concerned about the calculation of the 300,000 additional square feet for providing that western bike and pedestrian lane, which will also be a nice feature to have. But that feature also doubles as a 23-foot wide emergency vehicle access, which is required. So is that an incentive benefit? Is it a required emergency vehicle access? Is it both? I'm not sure. So I just hope someone's looking at this all very carefully. And since Google's gone way beyond what's required incentive-wise, maybe these kinds of calculations don't matter. But I thought it was a question. There's been quite a bit of discussion about the $12 million voluntary payment from Google for affordable housing. That voluntary payment earns them almost 750,000 square feet of space in the building, so it's not like a voluntary Christmas gift. But it is an incentive, which is part of the incentive plan, which, as was mentioned, I think, by Ms. Amorosi, I'm very glad to see that. I've been saying all along, please don't give away that extra height for free. So I was glad to see that plan. I think that plan might need some tweaking as we go along, but this appears to be nailed for now in this large development. So, yeah, I've also wondered where, what's the comparison of the benefits that we're getting for this from this development compared to the 5 times increase in the height allowed across this 9.5 acres. But discussion for another time, I guess, over a beer at this point. There are just 2 more things that I wanted to say. One is, are these mitigations sufficient and as good as they sound? There are a lot of us that are adults around here, and you can tell it to us straight. My radar goes up when I feel like I'm being told one thing and it's a certain marketing story, and it maybe isn't exactly the full story. So I would encourage the city to please continue to strive for the real story, because we can take it. So, for example, I'll give 2 quick examples. One is in the list of transportation improvements that Mr. Funt went through. That was quite a nice list. Many of those are required for a project of this size. It's not like these are gifts being given to the city. So it's not just coming out of the goodness of their heart. So let's be realistic about this. And another example is we've heard that this project is taking care to mitigate impact to the nearby residential folks, which is good, like the King County housing section that Ms. Dunlap mentioned. And as was also mentioned earlier by another speaker, the form-based code requires a 15-foot landscape buffer between that development and residential. And in the development agreement, it says that we will get a 20-foot building setback with a line of trees. So yay, 20 feet instead of 15, woohoo. But actually, we're getting 5 feet of landscaping and a 15-foot emergency vehicle access. So just tell me the right story. I don't feel like I'm being marketed to without getting the whole facts. So the other thing I'm hearing is this constantly saying that the maximum building height of the timber that's being used, the timber structure, is 180 feet. But these buildings are going to be more than 180 feet. So just tell us how big they're going to be so that we can trust what we're hearing. So I would like to conclude that just please be straight with us, and I truly hope that this really is a development that brings some wonderful things to our great city. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nobody else on your list, Kathy?
No one else has signed up.
Is there anyone else who would like to address the council at this time? Anybody online? Okay, seeing none, the public comment portion of this hearing is now closed. The council will consider all public comments received on this issue, including those submitted in writing. In terms of next steps, it is anticipated that an ordinance or resolution authorizing the execution of the proposed development agreement will be before the council for consideration at our regular meeting next Tuesday, July the 19th. With that,
Council, sorry, Madam Mayor, I don't know if you wanted to do any answers to some of the questions that.
Yes, that was the next step, is to go to questions from the council. Councilmember Pascal.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thanks to those who came out tonight, both virtually and in person, to provide comments. Appreciate it. And to those that have provided email comments over the many months and few years on this effort. I had a few things around transportation. I know that a lot of work has been gone into this. I missed the meeting last week, so so I have some questions and some comments that I'd like to be considered in the development agreement tonight. And just for context, in my profession, I've been involved in a number of development agreements over the years in other cities. So I kind of bring that perspective of what I've seen work well, and or things to consider as agreements are being finalized, primarily from the transportation perspective. And the reason why this is important is because both with the planned action and with the development agreement essentially green lights the development for, in this case, 10 years, perhaps 15 years, and this is a very sizable development, a size that, you just don't see very often in state. So that's why I want to make sure we're thinking about all the details. And this is really kind of our opportunity as a council to provide that. And it's all kind of coming to conclusion fairly quickly. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was that mode share. And thanks for Google has had a really great slide about their mode share target and also kind of what they're achieving for their other sites. I would really appreciate if Google could get back to me about what that information is for their existing sites. Is that data that was post-COVID? Is that data that's pre-COVID? Is that daily? Is that peak hours? What sites? I think that would be really important to have some more background to how they are achieving their mode share for other locations. One of the requirements that Joel mentioned was that parking would be monitored. And I think it's more about parking though, where I'd like to see ongoing monitoring of the transportation. So for me, it's a monitoring of the mode share. So it's not just about the number of cars being parked, it's how they're achieving the number of bike trips, number of transit trips, and so forth. So I'm hoping that can be more specific in the development agreement. That's a very standard evaluation that can be conducted. And I've seen that in other agreements that will help us make decisions as the phases go forward. So Joel, is that, I don't know if he's online still, but Joel, could you kind of just explain a little bit, is that ongoing study, is that more than just parking?
The way the agreement is currently written is that the monitoring that was the focus of the conversation was around parking utilization on the site and off the site. We did talk some about mode split, and certainly that is something that we typically monitor as part of our commute trip reduction programs and our transportation management plans. And so it is not specifically noted in the development agreement, but it is certainly something that we would, as we develop their TMP and their TDM program, that we would be looking at is those mode split targets and how they're achieving those, what those goals are, and then how they would be working towards those through the monitoring of their TMP.
Okay, well, I guess I would like some consideration of including that in the development agreement and put the onus on them, not on staff, to do that evaluation, because that's just another time and cost and resource that we're devoting to monitor that. And so that's something that I feel could be easily incorporated into the monitoring studies on their behalf. They're going to have a traffic consultant do it anyways. I'm confused why that wouldn't be incorporated. The independent review that I forget who mentioned that's actually something that I do see quite often. A consultant independent to who Google hired, independent to the city, that reviews the information that is provided. That happens quite frequently for developments much smaller and have less, that are even have nearly this ambitious mode share. This is the most ambitious mode share targets that I've seen. So I want to make sure that we monitor and that we have the resources in place to do that. So I'd be interested in seeing something a little bit more robust in the development agreement there. The other thing that, with that monitoring study is the access points. This is a 10, 15 year agreement. Things change, not just for Google, but things change on our transportation system. And for me, if there's going to be that mode share, there's going to be conflicts with bikes, pedestrians, with transit, with access. I think it would be important to make sure that those access points are included in the monitoring evaluation to make sure that things are operating safely. And if they're not safe, then we have appropriate recourse to address those issues. I mean, we're talking about, and the reason why I'm focusing on this is the magnitude here is so substantial compared to other developments we see across the city, across the region. So that's the reason why I'm I really taking a hard view of that. And then finally, I want to talk about concurrency a little bit. I'll be honest, I was a little surprised to read that they would be completely vested for all phases of concurrency. That is not a standard practice in the industry when you're looking at a 10 to 15 year timeframe. I would say that that's very infrequent. And if you look at the development agreements on the MRSC site, they require concurrency to be done as part of each phase. And the reason for that is because one development can basically reserve a significant chunk of the available capacity of the system and then could take 10, 15 years to build out. Obviously, it's the developer's interest to reserve it at the very beginning. I don't know of any developer that doesn't want to achieve concurrency at the very beginning. That's to their benefit and interest, but it's not necessarily to the benefit and interest of the city. And I would like some consideration of, particularly for phases 4 and 5, that concurrency not be reserved for those, or if it is, that meaning that they would have to look at concurrency again when those phases 4 and 5 come in. However, there's a couple nuances to that. One would be if they're building the system capacity up front from the infrastructure. So if the infrastructure improvements that they're making at the very beginning basically build the capacity for all the phases, then yes, it's fair to reserve that concurrency. But if they're not, then we're setting a pretty significant precedent in the city if we're doing this way. So if I was a developer coming in for any other development agreement, another developer, I'm going to be asking for the same thing. So how do we reconcile that? How is this a sustainable way of addressing concurrency going forward? So I would push back on that a little bit. I'd like to see a couple options there. I'd like to see the numbers about the infrastructure that they're building. Does that actually get them the system capacity up front for all phases? And if so, then I'm fine with it. But if not, I have some concerns. And then finally, I would just ask, I really feel like the development agreement should be an ordinance that has more teeth. I think, Mayor, you said at the end, a resolution or ordinance. I guess I just feel like an ordinance would be the more appropriate tool here, but I'd look to the city attorney for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Oh, Councilmember Falcone.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Adam, Tracy, Joel, John, and the entire team. I know this is a huge team effort on the city side. Thank you also to Ian from Google and Brian from Lake Washington School District for being here tonight. I really appreciate your partnership in this. And most of all, thank you to all the community members who have shared their thoughts with us, not only tonight, but previously as well. Thank you, Sharon, Colleen, Sue, Lori, Daniel, Curtis, and Liz for being here virtually or in person tonight to share your thoughts and questions with us. I really appreciate it. I'm still processing the things that we've heard tonight, but I do have some initial questions. So if you saw me looking down, folks in the community tonight, I was taking notes. That's why I was looking down. I was really listening intently. And, overall, I am really excited about the potential for the community benefits here, but I also hear the questions and concerns coming from the community. Okay, so I have a few questions, and I'll pause after each one in case staff wants to respond tonight, but I understand if they'd like to follow up later. I don't necessarily expect answers to all the questions tonight. My first question, have we asked Google to add a requirement or reference regarding collaboration with Lake Washington School District as requested in Brian's letter and public comment? And if not, I'd like us to have that discussion.
We have not.
Okay. Well, I'd like to add that to our conversation. And on the water infrastructure, I understand that Google doesn't need to install any upgrades since the plan meets the minimum fire flow requirements. And apologies in advance, I'm not a water flow expert, but I assume the community is not either. So, can you just explain what does this mean, if anything, for future development in this area? Like, will Google's development take up or use up a lot of this water flow capacity, therefore making it more likely that, say, a future housing development nearby is more likely to need to make such upgrades?
The fire flow for a commercial project of this size is driven by fire flow. So the domestic needs are much smaller. And so by code, the most fire flow that any project could require per the fire code is 8,000 gallons per minute. When projects sprinkled, the code allows that to be derated or discounted by 75%. So the project really only needs 2,000 gallons per minute. Today out there on site, the lowest amount of fire flow anywhere in and around the project site is 2,700. So it doesn't take away anything, assuming.
Thank you. So it wouldn't impact the needs of future development in the area at all. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And can we also talk to what is our general sense of the current tree coverage on the site compared to what's being proposed? And can you also confirm, I assume that Google will need to follow the replanting and fee and lieu requirements that are laid out in our recent tree code amendments, but if you could just confirm my understanding, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So I had actually asked Adam, planning director, to come speak to the tree code element, and also City Attorney Kevin Raven to speak to the appearance of fairness doctrine question that was raised earlier, but we'll have Adam speak to the tree code first.
Yeah, tree code. Yeah, it's funny to talk about the tree code when we've spent so much time talking about it before. but it's a very relevant set of rules in the city. I just want to make 3 points in regards to Ms. Cox's comments about the tree code. The first is, I want to say this unequivocally, that the tree code that was adopted by council a couple months ago would apply to this project completely in its updated form. We talked earlier about vesting, so what rules does the project vest in? And we talked about the fact that when the development agreement is effective, all of the existing rules in the Kirkland Municipal Code, the Kirkland Zoning Code, and the design guidelines would apply to the project, and those would include the tree code. We don't list out every specific provision of the zoning code that applies, but the tree code is obviously a really instrumental and important part of the code that would apply to this project. Second, I don't have a current calculation of the number or the percentage of tree canopy cover on the project site right now. It's fairly low, right? A lot of the project site right now are surface parking lots and buildings. So I think it's a very, very small fraction of tree canopy coverage. I think you probably know this, I know you know this from our discussions about the tree code, but the expectation in regards to the 40% tree canopy rule across the city, which is a policy in our comprehensive plan, is not really intended to apply on a parcel by parcel basis, right? It's sort of a balancing of factors. We know that we have big swaths of open space in the city. We know that we have very urbanized areas where we try to focus development. And those really urbanized parts of the city, there's no expectation that those will reach 40% canopy. We wouldn't be able to achieve all the other objectives that we want to achieve in the city, like affordable housing and compact development and walkability, if we imposed the 40% rule universally across the city. But what I would say is that based on the concept diagrams that have been provided by Google already, it's very, very likely and expected that tree canopy coverage would increase pretty substantially across the site. And that's something that we'll see when the design review packages come in for review. But the expectation is that there will be a pretty significant increase in tree coverage on the site.
Councilmember Black. Adam?
Thank you, Madam. Adam, can I ask you a quick question? We are, I guess, we're about as close as there is to experts on our tree code, since we just undertook a 3.5-year process to update our tree code. But our residents aren't necessarily experts on our tree code. Can you just clarify whether our tree code requires, not in connection with the removal of trees and then the replanting of trees as a mitigation, but does our tree code require a property owner to plant trees in order to achieve 40% on their lot?
There's not a lot by lot requirement for that, right? There are general requirements that apply to commercial properties, and then there's a tree credit approach that applies to single family projects, but there's not a universal rule that each property owner has to achieve 40% tree coverage. Otherwise, many properties across the city would probably fail that test.
Okay, thank you.
Back to you, Councilmember Falcone.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do have one more question, but I think the city manager mentioned that our city attorney was going to address something first. Is that correct, or should I go proceed with my
Why don't I go ahead and have the city attorney speak to the other issue that Ms. Cox raised, which was the appearance of fairness doctrine issue. And I think also in that was also a discussion of a potential conflict of interest. So maybe city attorney, if you could speak to both of those issues.
Thank you. And then after that, I just have one more question, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, City Manager, and good evening, Council and Mayor, Deputy Mayor. Well, on the appearance of fairness issue, appearance of fairness doctrine issue that Ms. Cox raised in her public testimony, first, I want to just start out by saying that the City of Kirkland takes the appearance of fairness doctrine very seriously. And we think important to note, however, that the appearance of fairness doctrine by law applies to quasi-judicial proceedings of governing bodies and not to legislative proceedings of governing bodies. So that quasi-judicial basically means that a legislative body like a council is sitting and acting as judges, for example, in the context of hearing and deciding an appeal from a land use matter. And the appearance of fairness doctrine actually doesn't apply to legislative matters where governing bodies like the city council are deciding policy or approving contracts. So the appearance of fairness doctrine doesn't actually apply to this process, but the sort of appearance and conflict issues are ones that we take very seriously. And if a council member felt that they stood to gain or lose one way or another based on the outcome of this issue, or that they couldn't be fair in making a decision on the agreement, I know that they would say so on the record, and that would give members of the public an opportunity to respond. The conflict of interest issue also came up in the context, or appearance of fairness issue came up in the context of the Planning Commission. I just wanted to speak very briefly to that. There was a reference made to 2 Planning Commission members that the speaker indicated had employment connections with Google. And I just wanted to point out for the record that one of those 2 Planning Commission members left Google's employment some years ago, and the second, and the one current Google employee that serves on the Planning Commission, recused himself completely from the process leading to the Planning Commission's recommendations on this issue. So in general, an appearance of fairness issue can be addressed by comments made on the record. Recusal is also an option, and in this particular instance, the Planning Commission member made a voluntary decision to recuse himself completely. And one last thing, I wanted to answer Councilmember Haskell's comment about resolution versus ordinance. I mean, the materials did indicate that we were moving in the direction of a resolution. The mayor remarked tonight that it could be a resolution or an ordinance that authorized the execution of the development agreement. By statute, either a resolution or an ordinance would work, and either approach would support enforcement of a binding contract. The point regarding the sense that an ordinance has more teeth as an act of law than a resolution, which is the expression of a policy supporting the execution of an agreement, is well taken. And I think the direction that we have from the city manager is to move in the direction of an ordinance, which is what I'll be working on for your consideration next week.
Thank you. Councilmember Nixon.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on the conflict of interest matter, I think most of the council knows I was deeply involved in creating the code of ethics for the council and boards and commissions. And the conflict of interest section of the code of ethics really identifies a conflict of interest occurring only when it's a financial conflict of interest, not simply an employment conflict of interest. You could have a conflict if you were an officer or director of a business, a corporation that was having an engagement with the city. But when it comes to, say, owning stock, being an owner, it only applies if it's only a conflict of interest if you own more than 1% of the shares of a publicly traded company. And for Alphabet, that would be $23 billion worth of stock. And I don't think anybody on our planning commission owns $23 billion worth of Alphabet. So I really appreciate that planning commissioner voluntarily recused himself, but the fact is he would not have been required to under our code of ethics. It was completely voluntary. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Councilmember Falcone.
Thank you. And I think this one should be brief. Can you please speak to the comment tonight regarding building electrification and the language of endeavoring to compared to fully committed to building electrification? Is that something that language that was specifically already negotiated in particular, or is that something that I guess, can you just please comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I can make just really brief comments on that. So that's in relation to the sustainability measures that are part of the project that are in the development agreement, which, as we discussed earlier, those are supplemental to the community benefits that are required, that would otherwise be required, right? We've shown that when you account for sort of the totality of community benefits, open space, and affordable housing payment, et cetera, that by itself exceeds an open space pedestrian and bike access that exceeds the community benefits that would otherwise be required by the form-based code. So the sustainability measures are on top of that, and some of those are still in flux, right? I mean, the building hasn't been designed yet to a lot of detail sufficient to submit, for instance, a design review permit application. So I think the language right now says that Google will endeavor to electrify their buildings 100%. It just doesn't commit to that 100%. I think that's a conversation that we could have with Google. But I think it's relatively early in their design phase. And so I think we understand why they haven't yet committed to that, but that's something we could discuss with them.
So could you speak to what does the form-based code actually say about electrified buildings?
There's it's not a requirement that buildings be 100% electrified. It's something that's in our high performing building code. And Jeremy is here to talk probably in more detail about electrification. Jeremy, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, if I could take a quick shot at it. The base requirement will be that the buildings are all electric. And the only exception provided in the current code in that baseline is for commercial cooking. You'll probably recall that from the high performance building code. So I think in terms of electric use in the buildings, I think what the development agreement is saying, we will endeavor to switch so all of our cooking is also electric, but everything else in the building would be electric. And then I would just add, in addition to that, I think what Google's also expressing is a goal that only electric vehicles are allowed on the site. So all of the transportation coming to and leaving from the site would be restricted to electric vehicles, which is not a code requirement in our high performance codes. So I think it's consistent with the high performing building codes for all electric buildings. There's a endeavor to make commercial cooking electric as well, and then beyond what we regulate for transportation as well.
Thank you. That was a helpful refresher on the exception for commercial cooking. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Councilmember Falcone. You are so good and gracious about thanking and acknowledging everyone's participation. And I, too, appreciate everyone that has taken the time to speak to us this evening. I just have a couple things, because fortunately, Councilmember Falcone covered most of them. I do support her recommendation that we talk about the collaboration with the Lake Washington School District and the development agreement, so I would like that in there. I received feedback, fair feedback, that I failed on last Wednesday to stress my support and enthusiasm for green roofs and green public park space on the record, so I would like to do that now. I agree with Ms. Hansen that I would love for Google to include green roofs in a combination with their other sustainability features, such as the ventilation and solar panels. And I also would like a public accessible green park space as a benefit on top of one of the buildings. Ian has heard me say that, but now I've said it publicly, so I know when he watches this again, he will hear me say it. So thank you, folks who provide us the feedback. We do listen. My other big question is, if Google doesn't move forward with phase 4, I assume that they'll be able to sell the remainder of the property. So then my question is, if the remainder of the property is sold, does it live under the form-based code, or does it live under the development agreement?
So I think the city attorney may need to speak to that. It sort of depends. Depends on if they assign it or they sell. So go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so there's two issues at least there, Councilmember Curtis. And the first is, as the city manager just mentioned, an assignment. So if Google at some point in the future were to wish to sell this property to a third party, to a non-Google third party, that would be an assignment of the rights and responsibilities that Google has under the development agreement. And the assignee, the party that acquired the project, would take subject to the development agreement, and the city would also have approval rights, which couldn't be unreasonably withheld over the assignment to a non-Google assignee. On the second issue is if the property were to be sold to a third party, it would be subject to the development agreement, and it wouldn't automatically revert to the code. I mean, a purchaser of the project would take subject to the rights and responsibilities of the development agreement.
So anything this assignee would want to change for the developers agreement would be a renegotiation with the city council?
Yeah, it would be
a major change.
It would require an amendment agreed to by both parties.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Follow up to that, Kevin, what would the assignee's responsibility be toward the $4 million?
They would, the assignee would take over both the rights and the responsibilities. And one of the rights of the assignee would be to the 40% if that wasn't addressed in the sale from Google to the third part if that wasn't already addressed in the assignment agreement, somebody would get the 40%. It would either be Google or the assignee, and it would be really up to them to decide that.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Councilmember Black.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And again, thank you to everyone who's given us comment. I just wanted to make one comment, which is that Councilmember Kurtz is being very generous when she says that's the first time she's gone on the record as asking for green roofs and park space. That's at least the 5th time I've heard it from her on the record in a public meeting.
Thank you, Councilmember Black. Okay, with that, I believe our conversation is complete. Councilmember Pascal, Councilmember Falcone, in which case I will declare this a meeting in adjournment. Thank you very much.